September 1st, 1939. The sky over Warsaw should have been painted in the soft hues of early autumn, cornflower blue with wisps of ivory cloud, the sun warming ancient cobblestones that had witnessed centuries of Polish history. Instead, that pristine September morning broke with an unnatural darkness. Not the gray shroud of rain clouds, but something far more sinister. The mechanical shadows of the Luftwaffe, hundreds strong, their engines drowning out the songbirds that had been heralding the dawn. The whistling came first, a high-pitched keening that sliced through the morning air, growing louder, more insistent, until it became a shriek that pierced eardrums and froze blood. Then impact, the beautiful, historic Polish capital, a city of spires and monuments, of cafes where intellectuals debated philosophy over coffee, of narrow streets where children played and lovers strolled, erupted into hellfire. Incendiary bombs transformed residential neighborhoods into roaring infernos. The heat was so intense it didn't just burn buildings. It melted the cobblestones themselves, turning the ancient streets into rivers of molten stone. In those first terrible hours, in the days of fire and thunder that followed, 4,000 civilian souls were extinguished, 40,000 lives snuffed out like candles in a hurricane, mothers clutching children, grandfathers who'd survived the Great War, young lovers who'd planned weddings they'd never attend, all consumed by a deliberate campaign of terror designed to break Warsaw's will. But here's the question that haunts anyone who walks Warsaw's streets at night. When a city burns so intensely that it melts the very cobblestones, when the air becomes so hot that people's lungs scorch from the inside, when 4,000 souls are torn from their bodies in screaming, burning agony, what happens to all that energy, all that terror, all that rage and despair and final, desperate prayer? Welcome back to Ghost Stories of the Battles, where we unearth the terrifying supernatural echoes left behind by history's bloodiest conflicts. The Siege of Warsaw was one of the opening salvos of World War II, and it set a horrifying precedent for the total war that would consume Europe. Hitler's blitzkrieg strategy demanded swift, overwhelming force, and the Luftwaffe delivered. For 28 days, from September 1st through September 28th, 1939, Warsaw burned. The German bombers didn't discriminate. They targeted military installations. Yes, but they also deliberately dropped incendiaries on densely packed residential neighborhoods, on hospitals marked with red crosses, on fleeing columns of civilians. The defenders fought with desperate courage. Outnumbered, outgunned, their supply lines cut, Polish soldiers and civilian volunteers manned barricades in the rubble-choked streets, fired at German tanks with rifles that could barely dent their armor, and watched helplessly as the Luftwaffe circled overhead like mechanical vultures. The city glowed orange at night, not from street lamps, but from the countless fires raging out of control. The smoke was so thick it blotted out the sun. Ash fell like snow, coating everything, everyone, in a fine gray shroud. The bombing raids followed a pattern. Early morning strikes targeted infrastructure, power stations, waterworks, communication centers. Midday raids hit military positions and government buildings. But the evening raids, those were designed for maximum psychological impact. They targeted residential neighborhoods when families would be home, when workers would have returned from their day shifts, when the maximum number of civilians would be trapped in their apartments and tenements. The Luftwaffe wanted to break the city's spirit, and they knew that killing soldiers was one thing. Killing families was another, and it wasn't just the bombs. The Luftwaffe dropped incendiaries, devices specifically designed to start fires that couldn't be easily extinguished. Thermite and magnesium bombs that burned so hot they melted through stone and metal. Firefighters found themselves battling blazes that defied every conventional technique. Water evaporated before it touched the flames. The fires created their own weather systems. generating winds that spread the flames as fast than anyone could move. People didn't just die from the bombs themselves. They died from the fires, from smoke inhalation, from buildings collapsing around them as the structural supports melted. The final blow came when the Germans systematically destroyed Warsaw's water supply. The mains were shattered, the pumping stations obliterated. With the fires still raging and no water to fight them or even to drink, with diseases spreading in the overcrowded bomb shelters and tens of thousands already dead, the Polish commander finally gave the agonizing order to surrender on September 28, 1939. The order was controversial even among the defenders. Some units wanted to fight on, to make the Germans pay for every street, every building, every inch of rubble. But the mathematics were brutal. Without water, the civilian population would die within days. The hospitals were already full of children dying from dehydration. The elderly were collapsing in the streets. The choice wasn't between surrender and victory. It was between surrender and watching the entire civilian population die of thirst while their homes burned around them. So the white flags went up, the guns fell silent, and the Germans marched into a city that looked like something from the apocalypse. Entire neighborhoods reduced to smoking rubble, streets blocked with collapsed buildings, the smell of death everywhere, heavy and inescapable. The occupation had begun, and it would last 6 years. 6 years of resistance and reprisal, of uprising and annihilation. But that's another story. The city that emerged from those 28 days was barely recognizable. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to charred skeletons. The streets were clogged with rubble and the unburied dead, and the smell, the sickening cocktail of burned wood, melted metal, and charred flesh, hung over the ruins like a curse. Warsaw was rebuilt, of course. The Poles are a resilient people. The old town you see today, with its colorful facades and bustling market square, is a meticulous reconstruction, a defiant act of memory and survival. After the war, after the occupation and the 1944 uprising, and 6 years of systematic destruction, there was almost nothing left. 90% of Warsaw had been deliberately demolished. The Germans had wired entire neighborhoods with explosives and systematically destroyed what the bombs hadn't already ruined. They'd wanted to erase Warsaw from the map, to make it as if the city had never existed. But the Poles refused to let that happen. They gathered old photographs, architectural drawings, paintings, any record of what the city had looked like. They interviewed survivors who remembered the buildings, the streets, the details. And brick by brick, stone by stone, they rebuilt. Not just any city, they rebuilt Warsaw. The same streets, the same buildings, the same colors. It was an act of resurrection, of defying those who tried to destroy not just a city but a people, a culture, a history. But beneath the fresh paint and the reconstructed walls, the original stones remember. The earth beneath the streets remembers, and according to those who've encountered them, so do the dead, because when 4,000 lives are snuffed out in a firestorm, when the air is filled with screams and prayers in a dozen languages, when children die calling for mothers who are already ash, that energy doesn't just dissipate. It soaks into the stones. It settles into the foundations. It waits. Our first story takes us into the basement archives of Old Town, where a skeptical American student learned that the past is never as dead as we'd like to believe. Story 1. The Ash Walkers of Old Town Mark Hennessy didn't believe in ghosts. At 26, he'd cultivated a carefully constructed worldview built on rationalism, evidence, and architectural blueprints. He was a doctoral student at MIT, specializing in post-war urban reconstruction, and Warsaw's Old Town was his thesis subject. A city quarter literally rebuilt from rubble and old photographs, a triumph of collective memory and engineering. He'd grown up in Boston, the son of an engineer father and a mathematics teacher mother. Dinner table conversations had revolved around proof and evidence, logic and reason. The Hennessy family didn't do superstition. They did facts. When his grandmother had claimed to see his grandfather's ghost after the funeral, his father had gently but firmly explained the psychology of grief-induced hallucinations. Mark had absorbed those lessons well. His academic work was rigorous, empirical, based on documents and measurements and verifiable data. The supernatural had no place in his research, his worldview, or his life, until Warsaw. His fellowship had brought him to Warsaw for 6 months of archival research. Most days, he worked in the basement of a reconstructed 16th century building that now housed the Municipal Historical Society. The basement was where they kept the pre-war documents that had survived: property records, architectural plans, photographs. Everything was meticulously organized in climate-controlled rooms that smelled of old paper and preservation chemicals. It was mid-October when Mark started staying late. His advisor back in Boston was breathing down his neck about deadlines, and Mark had fallen behind transcribing building permits from the 1930s. Tedious work, but necessary. The building closed to the public at 6 p.m., but the director had given Mark a key and permission to work whatever hours he needed. On the night it happened, Mark was alone in Archive Room 3, 3 levels below street level. The room was maybe 20 feet square, lined floor to ceiling, with steel shelving units packed with document boxes. A single, long fluorescent light fixture hummed overhead. His laptop sat on a folding table, casting a blue glow across stacks of yellowed permits he was photographing and cataloging. The permits were mundane: building extensions, roof repairs, the bureaucratic minutiae of a city going about its business in the summer of 1939, unaware of what September would bring. Mark had been transcribing them for hours, his eyes burning from screen fatigue, his neck stiff from hunching over the laptop. He'd just finished photographing a permit for a new bakery oven, dated August 15th, 1939, 2 weeks before the invasion. That bakery probably never opened. The oven probably never baked its first loaf. It was nearly 11 p.m. when he noticed the temperature change. At first, he thought the climate control was malfunctioning. The room, usually kept at a steady 65 degrees, started to feel warm, then warmer. Mark loosened his collar, took off his sweater. The warmth kept building, subtle at first, then increasingly uncomfortable. He checked his phone's weather app. Outside temperature, 42 degrees. Inside this basement, apparently, climbing toward sauna levels, he stood and walked to the climate control panel on the wall. The digital readout showed 66 degrees, barely above normal. But that couldn't be right. Mark was sweating. He could feel heat radiating from the walls themselves, as if the stone had been sitting in sunlight all day and was now releasing that stored warmth. Except these walls were 3 levels underground and hadn't seen sunlight in over 80 years. Mark thought about leaving, about finding a building manager, but it was 11 p.m. on a Thursday. The building was closed. There was a night security guard somewhere upstairs, but Mark didn't want to look like an idiot complaining about the heat when the thermostat said everything was fine. Maybe he was coming down with something. A fever. That would explain the sensation of heat. The smell came next. The familiar scent of old parchment and archival quality cardboard began to change, as if something underneath was asserting itself. A sharp, acrid note crept into the air. Sulfur, Mark's brain supplied, and something else, burning wood. Not the pleasant smell of a fireplace, but the raw, choking stench of a structure fire. Mark stood up, concerned now. A fire in a basement full of irreplaceable historical documents would be catastrophic. He looked around for smoke detectors. They were there on the ceiling, but none of them were sounding. No alarm. No sprinklers activating. Yet the smell of smoke was getting stronger, and the temperature was still climbing. He moved toward the door, intending to go upstairs and find a building manager, when the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a brownout. Instant, complete darkness. His laptop screen provided the only illumination, a small blue rectangle in an ocean of black. Mark fumbled for his phone, activated the flashlight. The beam seemed weaker than it should be. Swallowed by shadows that felt almost thick, almost physical, that's when he heard it. Distant at first, but growing clearer, an air raid siren. That distinctive up-and-down wail he'd only ever heard in old war footage. But this was no recording. The sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the walls themselves, making the steel shelving units resonate like tuning forks. Mark's rational mind was screaming that this was impossible. Air raid sirens hadn't sounded in Warsaw in over 80 years, but his animal hindbrain, the part that had kept his ancestors alive, was screaming something else entirely. Run, he tried the door handle. Locked. No, not locked. Stuck. Or maybe the door itself had changed, warped by heat that existed 85 years ago, but was bleeding through into the present. Mark's hands were shaking as he pulled at the handle, yanked it, his rational mind insisting this was ridiculous even as sweat poured down his face from the impossible heat. The siren continued its wailing cycle. Up and down, the sound boring into his skull. And now he could hear other things beneath it. The drone of aircraft engines, hundreds of them, a mechanical thunder that made the steel shelving units vibrate. The sound was coming from above, from the street level 3, floors up, except it wasn't really coming from there. It was coming from September 1939. Before he could move, the walls began to glow. Not from any light source he could identify. The stone walls of the basement, thick, solid, reconstructed from the rubble of the original building, started to emit a faint orange luminescence, as if somewhere beyond them, just on the other side of the stone, a massive fire was raging. The temperature spiked. Mark felt sweat break out across his forehead, his back. The air was becoming hard to breathe, thick and hot. The siren cut off abruptly, replaced by a sound that made Mark's blood freeze. The descending whistle of falling bombs. Distant at first, then closer, closer. The thud of impact shook the floor beneath his feet. Not a memory, not a recording. He felt it in his bones, in his teeth. The whole building seemed to shudder. Then came the sounds of people, screaming, panicked voices shouting in Polish, the desperate cries of children, all of it muffled, as if coming from very far away, or from a long time ago, but growing clearer with each passing second. The orange glow from the walls intensified. In that hellish light, Mark saw the shadows detach. They peeled away from the walls, like dark paint running in reverse. But these weren't shadows in any conventional sense. They were human-shaped, upright, moving with the terrible purposelessness of the damned. And they were made of ash, not solid ash, floating ash. Each figure was composed of thousands of tiny particles of gray-white ash that swirled and drifted in the superheated air, maintaining a roughly human form through some unknowable force. Mark could see through them. See the shelving units on the far wall, but their presence was undeniable. They were there. The particles that composed them glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire, pulsing with an inner light that had nothing to do with illumination and everything to do with trapped energy, trapped suffering. Mark watched as one figure's arm drifted apart into a cloud of particles, then reformed, the ash particles drawn back together by whatever force was animating them. There were dozens of them, materializing out of the orange glow. Men, women, children. Their faces were indistinct, features blurred by the swirling ash, but their agony was crystal clear. Their mouths were open in screams he couldn't hear, or couldn't hear yet. The sound came a moment later, a dry rustling like wind through dead leaves, but underneath it, just barely audible, the echo of human voices crying out in Polish, in Yiddish, in German, in all the languages that had been spoken in Warsaw's neighborhoods. They moved through the room like sleepwalkers, like dreamers trapped in a nightmare they couldn't wake from. They weren't aware of him, Mark realized. They were trapped in their own moment, reliving the horror of September 1939. The night the incendiary bombs turned this building, this exact spot where he stood, into an inferno. One of the ash figures drifted close to Mark's table. A woman, he thought, based on the shape. She wore what might have been a dress, though the details were lost in the constant swirl of particles. Her hands were pressed to her face. Behind her came two smaller figures, children, clinging to each other. The temperature was nearly unbearable now. Mark's shirt was soaked with sweat. The air was so hot it hurt to breathe, each inhale like pulling fire into his lungs. His vision was starting to blur from the heat. He needed to get out, now. But as he turned toward the door, one of the ash figures stopped moving, just stopped. Dead still in a room full of drifting, wandering shapes, and then, with terrible slowness, its head turned toward Mark. It saw him. The figure was tall, male, wearing what might have been a suit. Where its eyes should have been, there were just 2 points of brighter orange light, like coals in a dying fire. The figure stared at Mark for a long moment, and Mark felt something crawling along his skin, something that had nothing to do with the heat. Recognition, awareness, and something else. Hunger. In that gaze, Mark felt the weight of the figure's death. Not a vision exactly, but an overwhelming sensation. The memory of burning alive, of the incendiary bombs, chemical fire eating through flesh faster than nerves could die, of being aware for those final terrible seconds as skin blackened and lungs scorched from the inside. The figure wanted Mark to understand, needed him to understand. This is what happened here. This is what they did to us. Bear witness. The figure raised one arm, pointing at Mark. Its hand was a skeletal framework of ash, fingers extended. The mouth, if you could call it that, opened wider, impossibly wide, and for the first time Mark heard a sound from the ash walkers. A dry, crackling whisper that might have been a word, might have been a plea, might have been a curse. Polish, he thought. The whisper was in Polish. Though he couldn't make out specific words through the distortion, every other ash figure in the room stopped moving. Dozens of heads turned toward Mark in perfect, horrible unison. They began to drift toward him. Mark didn't remember deciding to move. One moment he was frozen in place, the next he was lunging for the door. His hand hit the metal push bar, shoved it down. The door swung open into the stairwell, and Mark practically threw himself through it. The stairwell was dark, lit only by emergency lighting that painted everything in sickly green. But it was cool, blessedly, impossibly cool after the hellish heat of the archive room. Mark took the stairs 3 at a time, his footsteps echoing in the concrete shaft. Behind him, he heard nothing. No footsteps, no whispers. But he didn't slow down, didn't look back, until he burst through the ground floor door and out into the October night. The air outside was cold and clean and real. Mark stood on the sidewalk, hands on his knees, gasping for breath. His shirt was still soaked with sweat despite the chill. He looked back at the building, the reconstructed 16th century facade, warm yellow light glowing in the upper windows where the staff offices were. Everything looked perfectly normal, except for the smell. His clothes reeked of smoke, not cigarette smoke, not wood smoke from a fireplace. The acrid, chemical stench of burning, of things that weren't meant to burn. And underneath that, something worse. The sweet, nauseating odor of charred meat. Mark walked back to his apartment in a daze. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat at his computer, searching through the historical records he'd already digitized, looking for anything about that specific building during the siege. His hands were still shaking as he typed. The smell of smoke clung to him despite having showered twice, scrubbing his skin raw. His clothes were in a garbage bag outside his apartment door, but he could still smell them. Charred flesh, burning hair, chemical fire. His rational mind insisted it was psychosomatic, a trauma response, but his nose didn't care about rationality. The search was methodical. Building permits, construction records, property registrations. He cross-referenced addresses, compared pre-war and post-war records. The digital archive he'd been building for his dissertation suddenly took on a different meaning. These weren't just data points anymore. These were people, real people who'd died real deaths. He found it at 4 a.m. The building had been repurposed as a civilian bomb shelter in September 1939. The basement archives, the exact rooms where Mark had been working, had been packed with families from the neighborhood. On September 25th, 3 days before the surrender, a Luftwaffe bomber scored a direct hit with an incendiary bomb. The device penetrated the upper floors and detonated in the basement. Everyone inside was incinerated. The report, translated from Polish, used the word instantly, but Mark doubted that was true. He'd felt that heat. He'd seen those faces. There had been nothing instant about it. The official death toll for that single basement was 63 people. 34 adults, 29 children. Their remains had been so thoroughly cremated that individual identification was impossible. They'd been buried in a mass grave in the Pulaski Cemetery. Mark stared at the names. Some of them anyway, the ones that had been recorded. The Kowalski family, the Nowaks, the Wisniewskis. Ordinary people who'd thought a basement shelter would save them. He never went back to the archives. He sent an email to the director, claiming a family emergency, and transferred his research to a different institution. His thesis advisor was furious, but Mark didn't care. He finished his doctorate using secondary sources and published papers, but he never published what he'd experienced that night in the basement, because who would believe him? Rational, skeptical Mark Hennessy, who didn't believe in ghosts, who'd built his worldview on evidence and blueprints, except now he knew. The blueprints didn't tell the whole story. The reconstructed facades might look pristine, but underneath, in the old stones and the foundation soil, the past was still screaming. And on certain nights, when the conditions were right, the Ashwalkers returned to the place where they died, reliving their final moments for eternity. The fire wasn't confined to public shelters and basement archives. It invaded the homes where people felt safest, the apartments where families had built lives across generations. The incendiary bombs didn't distinguish between military targets and residential districts. A mother tucking her children into bed, a grandmother saying evening prayers, a young couple dreaming of the future. The bombs found them all. In the Praga district, on the east bank of the Vistula, the siege hit with particular ferocity. The area's mix of apartment blocks and industrial buildings made it a strategic target, but strategy meant nothing to the families living there. For them, the siege meant huddling under tables, in closets, in bathtubs, anywhere that offered even the illusion of protection from the bombs raining down from the sky. Many of those buildings still stand, renovated and modernized. New families live in them now, unaware of the memories soaked into the walls. Unaware, that is, until the past decides to make itself known. Story 2. The phantom raid of Progoserov Mitchell had moved to Warsaw for love. Well, for a job first. A marketing position with a tech startup. But she'd stayed for Tomas, the graphic designer she'd met at a company party. They'd dated for a year before she decided to make it permanent, signing a lease on her own apartment in Praga. She was 28, from Seattle, used to rain and coffee culture and the comfortable liberalism of the Pacific Northwest. Warsaw had been an adjustment. The language barrier, the different social norms, the weight of history that seemed to press down on everything. But she'd been determined to make it work. To prove to her parents back home that she hadn't made a mistake by chasing romance across an ocean. The apartment was perfect, or so she thought. Third floor of a pre-war building that had been completely renovated 5 years earlier. Original exposed brick, modern fixtures, huge windows overlooking a quiet courtyard. The landlord, an elderly woman named Pani Kowalska, had given Sarah a good deal on the rent, seeming almost relieved to have an American tenant. The building has good bones, Pani Kowalska had said in careful English. Her accent thick, but her words precise. Very strong. It survived many things. The war, you understand. The rebuilding, many years. Good bones. At the time, Sarah had thought it was just the elderly woman's way of emphasizing the building's quality. Only later would she understand that Pani Kowalska had been trying to warn her. Or maybe to justify what was about to happen. Sarah had signed the lease on the spot. She moved in on a sunny Saturday in late September, spending the day arranging furniture and hanging prints on the walls. Tomas helped, making jokes about her terrible taste in decor. They ordered pizza, drank wine on the tiny balcony overlooking the courtyard, and agreed that life was pretty damn good. That was the last normal night Sarah would spend in the apartment. The first incident happened at exactly 3 Namzid a.m. on her third night there. Sarah woke to the sound of voices, muffled, indistinct, but definitely voices. They were speaking Polish, rapid and urgent, the tone unmistakable even if she couldn't understand the words. Panic. Someone was panicking. Sarah's first thought was the neighbors. The building had been renovated, but clearly the walls weren't as soundproof as advertised. She lay in bed, irritated, listening to what sounded like a family argument. A man's voice, deeper. A woman responding, higher pitched. And underneath it all, a baby crying. That distinctive, exhausting wail of an infant in distress. The sound went on for maybe 10 minutes, then gradually faded. Sarah tried to get back to sleep, but found herself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was going to be a regular thing. She'd have to mention it to the landlord. Maybe there was some kind of sound insulation that could be added. She'd read about that. Acoustic panels, foam barriers, things you could install to deaden sound transmission. The next night, same thing. 3 a.m. Precisely. The voices, the crying baby, the sense of urgency. Sarah got out of bed and pressed her ear against the wall shared with the adjacent apartment. The sounds seemed to be coming from there, but also not. They had a strange quality, as if they were filtering through more than just a wall. Through distance, maybe. Or time. In the morning, Sarah ran into her neighbor in the hallway, a young guy who worked night shifts at a hospital. She asked him, carefully, if he'd been hearing any noise from the other apartments. He looked at her strangely. Noise? No. Why, are you hearing something? Just voices sometimes, at night. I thought maybe someone was having arguments. The neighbor's expression shifted to something Sarah couldn't quite read. Concern? Wariness? This is a quiet building, he said finally. Very quiet. Most of us work odd hours. Nobody makes noise. Oh, Sarah said. Okay, maybe it's coming from outside then. The neighbor nodded slowly, but his eyes said he didn't believe her. Or worse, he believed her but didn't want to talk about it. That evening, Sarah mentioned it to Tomas. He laughed it off, said she was probably hearing pipes or traffic sounds distorted by the old building's acoustics. He offered to stay over that night to prove there was nothing to worry about. It's an old building, he said, pulling her close on the couch they'd assembled together just days before. Old buildings make weird noises. The plumbing, the heating system, thermal expansion of the materials, all completely normal. You'll get used to it. Sarah wanted to believe him. She wanted this to be normal, fixable, something she could get used to. But there was something about the precision of the timing, exactly 3 a.m., not 2:58 or 3:02, and the emotional quality of the sounds that made her doubt the pipe's explanation. Pipes didn't sound panicked. Pipes didn't sound like a family in mortal terror. At 3 a.m., Tomas woke her up, his face pale in the darkness. Sarah, he whispered. What the fuck is that? The voices were back. Louder now, more distinct. Sarah could make out individual words. Pionacy, basement, bombi, bombs, Shibko, quickly. The man's voice was shouting now, and the woman was crying, and the baby wouldn't stop screaming. And then a new sound joined the chorus, the clatter of dishware vibrating against a wooden table. Sarah and Tomas sat up in bed, staring at Sarah's dining table across the room. Her plates and coffee mugs sat undisturbed on the surface, but the sound, that distinct rattle of ceramic shaking, was unmistakable. "The building's shaking?" Tomas said. "Small earthquake, maybe?" But Sarah was looking at her water glass on the nightstand. The surface was perfectly still, the voices crescendoed, then cut off abruptly. The rattling stopped. Silence rushed back in, oppressive and complete. Sarah and Tomas sat in the darkness, not touching, barely breathing. "I'm staying at my place tonight," Tomas said finally. He left at 3:30 a.m., making excuses about an early meeting. Sarah didn't try to stop him. The next night, Sarah decided to document it. She set up her phone to record audio, placed it on the nightstand, and forced herself to stay awake until 3 a.m. The voices came on schedule. Sarah hit record and lay in the darkness, listening to the panic and fear pour through her walls. This time, she tried to focus on the words, her basic Polish lessons struggling to keep up. "Pod stół," the man's voice shouted, under the table. "Gdzie jest Ania?" the woman cried. "Where is Ania?" And underneath it all, that relentless sound of vibrating dishware, and now something new. A deep, resonant hum like distant engines. The recording picked up nothing but Sarah's breathing. When she played it back in the morning, there was only silence. That's when she stopped trying to rationalize it. Something was wrong with this apartment. Something that had nothing to do with thin walls or acoustics or pipes. She called Pani Kowalska, the landlord, and asked point blank, "Has anyone else complained about strange noises in this apartment?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, quietly, "The last tenant left after 2 months. She didn't say why. The one before that, 3 weeks. I thought perhaps an American wouldn't be so superstitious." "Superstitious about what?" Another pause. "The building is old, Miss Mitchell. It has memories. Some people are sensitive to such things. Some are not. I had hoped you would not be." Sarah wanted to break the lease right then, but the deposit had been her entire savings, and Pani Kowalska made it clear she wouldn't be returning it for a tenant who chose to leave before the contract was up. Sarah was stuck. She tried sleeping with headphones in, but that somehow made it worse. The isolation, the inability to hear what was happening around her. She tried staying up past 3 Life a.m., but exhaustion would claim her eventually, and she'd wake to find the voices mid-conversation. Already in full panic, Sarah started researching the building during her lunch breaks at work. She found old property records, scanned newspaper archives, looked for anything that might explain what was happening. The building had been constructed in 1925, originally as a workers' tenement. Nothing unusual there. Half of Praga's buildings dated from that era. It had survived the war, though she couldn't find specifics about damage sustained during the siege. She found a Polish colleague at work, Kazia, who spoke better English than most. Casually, trying to sound curious rather than desperate, Sarah asked about the 1939 siege. About Praga specifically, Kazia's expression darkened. Praga was hit very hard. The Luftwaffe, they bombed everything. Residential areas, churches, schools. They didn't care. My grandmother lived through it. She never talked about it much, but when she did, Kasia shook her head. She said the worst part wasn't the bombs themselves. It was waiting for them, hearing the sirens and not knowing if this time your building would be hit. If this time you'd die. She said everyone went a little crazy from the waiting. Did people die in their apartments? Sarah asked. I mean, were they hit while they were inside? Or did most people get to shelters? Kasia looked at her strangely. Many died in their homes. The bombing happened at all hours. Sometimes shelters were hit too. Sometimes the buildings just collapsed, buried everyone inside. Why are you asking about this? Just interested in the history of where I'm living. Sarah lied. Then, 3 weeks after moving in, the haunting escalated. Sarah woke at 3 a.m. as usual, the voices already filling the room. But this time, as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she realized something was different. The room looked wrong. The shapes were off. Her modern IKEA furniture seemed to shimmer and fade, and underneath it, like a double exposure photograph, she could see different furniture. Older furniture, a heavy wooden dining table in the corner where her desk should be, chairs with carved backs, a cabinet with glass doors displaying dishes, and hanging on the wall where her prints should be, a large photograph of a stern-looking man in a military uniform from the 1930s. Sarah tried to sit up, tried to move, but her body wouldn't respond. Sleep paralysis, her rational mind supplied. You're still asleep. This is a dream, but she could feel the sheets beneath her fingers, could smell the air, different now, carrying the scent of coal smoke and old wool. And the voices weren't muffled anymore. They were clear. They were in the room with her. The transformation was gradual but inexorable. Sarah's modern white walls were fading, becoming older wallpaper, a floral pattern, faded and water-stained. Her ceiling light fixture dissolved into a simpler hanging bulb with a fabric shade. The hardwood floors she'd admired were now covered with a worn rug, its pattern barely visible under years of use. Even the air tasted different, heavier, with undertones of cabbage and coal dust and human fear. Under the wooden dining table, huddled together, was a family. A man in his 30s, wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. A woman in a patterned dress, younger, pretty, with dark hair pulled back. She was clutching a baby to her chest, rocking it frantically, and next to her a little girl, maybe 4 years old, with wide, terrified eyes. They were translucent, spectral, but more solid than any ghost Sarah had imagined. She could see the details of their faces, the tears streaming down the woman's cheeks, the way the man's hands trembled as he held his family close. They weren't looking at Sarah. They were looking up at the ceiling, frozen in a moment of absolute terror. That's when Sarah heard the sound that had been building underneath the voices all along. The deep, droning hum of aircraft engines, lots of them, growing louder, and cutting through that mechanical thunder, the distinctive, nightmare-inducing shriek of a Stuka dive bomber. The floorboards beneath Sarah's bed began to vibrate. Not an earthquake. Something above them in the sky, screaming downward. The sound was so loud it hurt, so visceral that Sarah's teeth ached and her vision blurred. The spectral family pressed themselves tighter under the table. The woman covered the baby's head with her hand, as if that would help. The little girl put her hands over her ears and screamed, a thin, terrified sound that cut straight through Sarah's paralysis. And then the ceiling exploded. Except it didn't, not really. Sarah was watching a memory, a phantom recording of an event that had happened over 80 years ago. But in that moment, trapped in whatever time slip she'd fallen into, it was real. The ceiling above the family blew apart in a silent, slow-motion eruption of spectral debris, plaster and beams and bricks, all tumbling down in a gray cloud of destruction. The bomb had penetrated the upper floors and detonated in the apartment, and Sarah was watching it happen. The mother lunged over her children, her body a pathetic shield against tons of falling masonry. The father threw himself across all of them, one arm stretched upward, as if he could hold back the collapse with his bare hand, and then the debris cloud consumed them, and everything went black. Sarah came to gasping, her body her own again, able to move. She threw herself out of bed and stumbled to the light switch, slapping it on. The apartment flooded with harsh white light from the overhead fixture. Everything was back to normal. Her IKEA desk, her prints on the wall, her familiar things. No wooden table, no cabinet, no photograph of a stern military man. Just her modern renovated apartment, except for one thing. In the corner of the room, where the phantom table had been, where the family had huddled, there was a thick layer of gray dust coating the floor. Not the usual household dust, but something older, finer. Plaster dust, historical dust. Sarah didn't touch it. She grabbed her phone, her wallet, and her keys, and she walked out of the apartment in her pajamas. She went to Thomas's place and buzzed his intercom until he answered, groggy and confused. "I need to stay here," she said. "I can't go back to that apartment." Thomas let her in, made her tea, held her while she shook. He didn't ask for details, and Sarah was grateful. How could she explain what she'd seen? How could she make anyone understand? The next day, Sarah went to the local library and pulled up historical records for her building. It didn't take long to find. The building had been hit by artillery on September 23, 1939. The top floor, her floor, had taken a direct hit. The records listed 4 casualties: Kazimierz Nowak, age 32, Zofia Nowak, age 28, Ania Nowak, age 4, and baby Marek Nowak, 8 months old. The family had been sheltering under their dining room table when the shell penetrated the ceiling and detonated inside the apartment. Death was listed as instantaneous, but Sarah knew better now. She'd seen their faces. She'd heard their screams. There had been nothing instantaneous about it. The Nowak family had been buried in a mass grave along with other siege victims. The building had been partially destroyed but remained standing. After the war, it had been repaired, then renovated multiple times, until finally being completely modernized 5 years ago. But the Nowaks were still there, Sarah realized, still trapped under that table, still living through the worst moment of their lives, every night at 3 a.m., the exact time the shell had hit. Sarah broke her lease. Pani Kowalska tried to keep the deposit, but Sarah threatened to report the haunting to the housing authority. The landlord relented, probably realizing that word of a haunted apartment would make it impossible to rent. As Sarah packed her things during daylight hours, she found herself pausing at that corner of the room. The dust had been cleaned up. She'd done that herself the morning after. But if she looked closely, she could still see the outline on the floorboards. A rectangular shape, the size of a dining room table, and smaller shapes inside it, grouped together, a family huddled for protection that never came. Sarah left Warsaw 2 months later. She and Tomasz tried to make it work long distance for a while, but the relationship didn't survive. Some experiences change you too much to go back to normal. She still thinks about the Nowaks sometimes, still wonders if they're still there, still reliving that moment, still hoping that this time, somehow, the outcome will be different, still believing that a wooden table and a father's body might be enough to hold back the sky. The fire and the bombs were horrors enough, but the siege brought a slower, more insidious torture as well. The Luftwaffe's strategy wasn't just to destroy buildings, it was to break the will of the defenders and the population, and they knew exactly how to do it. Water. Something so basic, so essential, that its absence becomes unbearable in days. With the fires raging throughout the city, with wounds that needed cleaning and children crying from thirst, Warsaw's water supply became more precious than gold, more critical than ammunition. And when the Germans systematically targeted the pumping stations and shattered the water mains, they turned the siege from a battle into a death sentence. The defenders fought on, but without water, they couldn't last. The civilian population couldn't last. On September 28th, when the Polish commander finally ordered the surrender, the city's water supply had been completely destroyed. People were dying of thirst in a city built on the banks of a river because there was no way to pump the water, no way to treat it, no way to get it to the desperate population. In the underground infrastructure, in the pipes and pumping stations that had once brought life to the city, something else lingered, the echoes of that desperate thirst. The memory of people dying for a single drop of water. Story 3. The thirst of the fallen David Chen was 29 and made his living exploring places people had forgotten. His YouTube channel, Abandoned Echoes, had built up a respectable following by documenting derelict buildings, old infrastructure, and urban decay. His viewers loved the combination of history, atmosphere, and David's casual, informative narration style. He'd started the channel 5 years ago, while still in graduate school for industrial archaeology. What had begun as a way to document his research had evolved into a full-time career. David was good at what he did, respectful of the spaces he explored, knowledgeable about their history, and careful not to sensationalize or vandalize. He'd built a reputation as one of the responsible urban explorers, which was why institutions sometimes granted him access to places normally off-limits. Warsaw was supposed to be a gold mine. The city had layers of history, reconstructed, rebuilt, but underneath it all, fragments of the old infrastructure remained. Sewers from the 19th century, bunkers from World War II, the ghost of the communist-era metro system. David had planned a whole series, Warsaw's Hidden History. He'd obtained special permission to explore a decommissioned municipal water pumping station near the Vistula River. The facility had been built in the 1920s, damaged during the 1939 siege, repaired, used throughout the communist era, and finally shut down in the 1990s when newer facilities came online. Now it served as a minor museum, a few rooms of pumping equipment and historical displays about Warsaw's water system. But the underground sections, the deep aqueducts and access tunnels that connected to the city's arterial water mains, had been sealed off for safety reasons. David had sweet-talked the museum director into giving him access. For his channel, he'd explained, to document an important piece of Warsaw's infrastructure history. The director, an elderly man who seemed tired and sad, had eventually agreed on the condition that David take a safety escort. The escort had called in sick that morning. David, on a tight filming schedule, decided to go alone. He had his equipment, professional camera, backup lights, extra batteries, water, and his phone for emergencies. He'd explored hundreds of abandoned spaces. This would be no different. He should have known better. The entrance to the underground section was through a heavy metal door at the back of the museum. David descended a modern steel staircase that had clearly been added long after the original construction. His camera light swept across brick walls that glistened with moisture, decades of seepage creating mineral deposits that looked like frozen waterfalls. At the bottom of the stairs, the modern construction ended. David found himself in a tunnel that dated back to the 1920s, arched brick ceiling, floor worn smooth by decades of maintenance workers' footsteps. The air was cool and damp, carrying the earthy smell of deep underground spaces. The bricks were impressive, solid engineering from an era when things were built to last centuries. David ran his hand along the wall as he walked, feeling the slight roughness of the mortar, the cool dampness that came from being this far below the water table. This was what his viewers came for, the tactile connection to history, the sense of walking where workers from 100 years ago had walked. He narrated as he walked, keeping his voice calm and professional. So we're about 30 feet below street level now, in one of the main access tunnels to the old water distribution system. During the 1939 siege, these tunnels were critical to the city's survival, until the Germans started systematically targeting the infrastructure. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, a junction point where several pipes converged. The pipes were massive, at least 5 feet in diameter, made of riveted iron that had been painted and repainted over the years. Now they were just rust and peeling layers, long since drained. David panned his camera across the space, noting the various pipes and valves. Some had been tagged with graffiti, Polish punk band names, and dates from the 1980s, evidence that this place hadn't always been sealed off. He could make out Deserter spray-painted in fading letters, and Tilt from the early days of Polish punk. Kids had gotten down here somehow, maybe when security was laxer during the communist era, and left their mark. The engineering was impressive, David thought, the scale of it. This was a system designed to serve a city of millions, built in an era before computer modeling and modern materials science. just raw engineering knowledge, mathematics, and brute force construction. The Poles had always been good at that. Building things to last, building things that would survive whatever history threw at them. That's when he heard it. Faint but distinct, the sound of water splashing. David paused, frowning. That didn't make sense. The system had been drained decades ago. There shouldn't be any water down here. Certainly not enough to create that kind of splashing sound, like someone cupping water in their hands and letting it fall. "You guys hearing that?" he said to his camera, his narrator voice slipping. "That's weird." He followed the sound deeper into the facility, down a side tunnel that sloped downward. The splashing grew louder, more distinct, and now there were other sounds mixed in. Scratching, like fingernails on metal, and voices. Dry, raspy voices speaking Polish. David's rational mind knew he should turn back. This was exactly the kind of situation that got urban explorers killed. Following strange sounds into unfamiliar territory, going off alone. But his curiosity, the same drive that had built his channel, pushed him forward. The side tunnel ended at a massive cylindrical holding tank, probably 30 feet in diameter. The iron hatch was open, revealing a dark interior. The splashing sounds were coming from inside, echoing in the metal space. David approached the hatch and shined his light inside. The tank was empty, bone dry, just rust and mineral deposits coating the bottom. But the sound of splashing water continued impossibly from that dry metal space, and now he could make out the voices. They were speaking Polish, but the words were clear enough. Woda, water, prosi, please, over and over, like a prayer, like a mantra, like the last desperate plea of dying men. David's camera battery indicator started blinking. Fully charged 20 minutes ago, now showing less than 10%. His backup lights flickered. The temperature was dropping. He could see his breath suddenly, white clouds in the beam of his dying flashlight. The cold wasn't natural. It was aggressive, invasive, the kind of cold that bypasses your clothes and skin and goes straight to your bones. David's fingers were going numb where they gripped his camera. Frost was forming on the metal pipes, spreading in crystalline patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost like reaching hands, and the voices were growing more desperate. Not just Woda anymore, but full sentences in rapid Polish. David didn't speak the language, but desperation needs no translation. These were the voices of people dying slowly, agonizingly, of thirst. The kind of death that gives you time to think, time to understand exactly what's happening to you, time to beg. "Okay," David said aloud, trying to keep his voice steady. "This is officially creepy. I think we're done here." But as he turned to leave, the voices inside the tank crescendoed. The dry, rasping pleas became screams. Dozens of voices crying out at once in desperate, thirst-maddened agony. And the splashing sound became frantic scratching, metal on metal, like people clawing at the tank walls, trying to find moisture, trying to reach water that wasn't there. David ran. Not a careful retreat, not a measured withdrawal, but a flat-out sprint back the way he'd come. His camera bounced against his chest on its strap, the dying light creating wild shadows on the tunnel walls. Behind him, the sounds followed, the splashing, the scratching, the voices begging for water in a language he couldn't understand. He burst into the junction chamber and pulled up short. The space was no longer empty. There were people in the chamber, dozens of them, but they weren't solid. They were translucent, spectral, their forms flickering like old film footage. Emaciated figures in tattered uniforms and civilian clothes, covered in soot and dried blood. Some in Polish army uniforms from 1939, others in the work clothes of laborers and maintenance men. Women in dresses, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. They were all fixated on the pipes, pressing their mouths to the rusted metal, clawing at the valves with skeletal fingers, trying desperately to coax water from a system that had been dead for decades. David stood frozen, his journalist's brain still trying to process what he was seeing even as his survival instincts screamed at him to run. These figures, these ghosts, because what else could they be, were acting out their final moments, the moment when hope died, the moment when they realized that breaking into this facility, risking German fire and artillery to get here, had been for nothing. The pipes were empty, the system was destroyed. They would die of thirst in a room full of water infrastructure, and the irony of it was as cruel as the Germans had intended. He could see the details now in his failing light. A soldier, his uniform hanging loose on a frame that had clearly lost significant weight during the siege. His hands were bloody from clawing at the metal valves, trying to force them open, trying to will water into existence. An old woman, her dress covered in dust and ash, had her ear pressed against a pipe, listening, hoping to hear the sound of flowing water somewhere deeper in the system. Two young men, maybe brothers based on their similar features, were working together to try to unscrew a massive valve wheel, their phantom muscles straining with effort that would never, because the valve had been empty for 85 years. And children. Dear God, there were children. A girl, maybe 8 years old, was crouched by a drain, trying to lick moisture from the metal. A boy even younger was crying, the sound thin and desperate, calling out "Mama" over and over while the spectral adults around him were too far gone in their own suffering to respond. The temperature had plummeted. David's breath came out in thick white clouds. His hands were going numb, and the battery on his camera was dead, the light extinguished. Only his backup flashlight remained, and it was dimming fast. One of the spectral figures turned toward him. A man in a Polish army uniform, his face blackened with soot, his lips cracked and bloody, his eyes sunken, desperate, locked onto David, or more specifically, onto the water bottle clipped to the side of David's backpack. The soldier's mouth opened, and that dry, rasping voice emerged. "Woda, Praza, Woda." The other figures turned as well, one by one, until dozens of spectral faces were staring at David, at his water bottle. Their translucent forms began to drift toward him, arms outstretched, mouths working soundlessly. That single word echoing from all of them at once. "Water, please, water." David felt invisible hands plucking at his backpack, at his clothes. The temperature was so cold now that ice was forming on the metal pipes, frost spreading across the brick walls. His flashlight dimmed to almost nothing. "I'm sorry," David whispered. "I'm sorry." He unclipped the water bottle from his backpack and dropped it on the floor. It hit with a plastic crack, and the cap popped off. Water spilled out onto the ancient bricks, spreading in a clear puddle. The spectral figures swarmed to it. Dozens of translucent bodies crowding around that tiny puddle, dropping to their knees, pressing their insubstantial faces to the wet stones. Trying desperately to drink from water they could never touch, trying to quench a thirst that had killed them 85 years ago. David didn't wait to see more. He ran for the stairs, his flashlight finally dying completely, leaving him in total darkness. He felt his way along the tunnel walls by touch, scraped his shoulder on a pipe, crashed into the staircase, and hauled himself up step by step, using the railing. He burst through the metal door into the museum, into bright fluorescent light and the normal, warm, dry air of the world above. A security guard looked up from his phone, startled. "You okay?" the guard asked in Polish-accented English. "You look like you see ghost." David couldn't even answer. He just sat on the floor, shaking, until he was sure his legs would work again. Later that evening, back in his hotel room, David reviewed his camera footage. Most of it was corrupted, strange digital artifacts, blocks of static, frames that didn't make sense. But the audio had survived, and when he played it back, listening through headphones, he could hear them clearly. Dozens of voices layered over each other, all rasping the same words. "Woda, proja, woda, water. Please, water." The desperate pleas of men and women dying of thirst while fires raged above them, while the city's water mains lay shattered. while the taps ran dry and the wells were contaminated, and the river might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did them. David never posted the footage. He couldn't. How could he monetize the suffering of the dead? How could he turn their agony into content for his viewers to consume with their morning coffee? He did research instead. The old pumping station had been used as a shelter during the final days of the siege. When the water supply was destroyed, desperate civilians and soldiers had broken into the facility, hoping to find some water remaining in the pipes, in the holding tanks, anywhere. Historical records suggested at least 50 people had died in or near the facility. Some from wounds, some from the bombs, but many from simple dehydration. They died within yards of equipment that was designed to pump thousands of gallons per day, died with their mouths pressed to dry pipes, died calling out for water that would never come, and on certain nights, in that cold underground space, they were still calling out, still searching, still dying of thirst, over and over for all eternity. David deleted the footage. He posted a different video about Warsaw instead, focusing on the rebuilt old town, the resilience of the Polish people, the triumph of Reconstruction. His viewers loved it. It got great engagement, but late at night, alone in whatever city his travels took him to next, David would sometimes wake from nightmares of cold underground spaces and voices begging for water. And he'd get up, go to the bathroom, and drink straight from the tap, gull after gulp of cold, clean, abundant water, because he could, because he wasn't trapped in 1939, because for him, water was just a turn of a faucet away. The ghosts in the pumping station didn't have that luxury. For them, the thirst would never end. On September 28, 1939, the Polish commander issued the order to surrender. After nearly a month of bombardment, with the water supply destroyed, food running out, and 4,000 civilians dead, there was no choice left. The defense had been heroic but ultimately futile. The order went out. Lay down your arms, raise the white flags, the battle is over. But in the chaos of a besieged city, in the smoke and ruins and the deafening aftermath of artillery fire, not every soldier received that order. Some units were cut off, their communications destroyed. Some were so deep in the fighting, so committed to holding their positions, that they couldn't hear anything but the sound of gunfire, and some, according to those who've encountered them, never accepted that the order was given at all. Story 4. The barricade that never John Patterson had served 20 years in the U.S. Army before retiring, including 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. He'd seen combat, lived through the chaos and terror of modern warfare, and carried the weight of those experiences in ways that never quite left him. He'd enlisted at 18, fresh out of high school in rural Pennsylvania, looking for direction and purpose. The Army had given him both, along with scars he couldn't show anyone and memories that woke him at 3 a.m. He'd been a good soldier, reliable, competent, the kind of NCO that younger soldiers looked up to. He'd made sergeant, then staff sergeant, and had been considering going for his commission when his wife had asked him to retire. 20 years was enough, she'd said. Come home, so he had. He'd retired at 38, got a civilian job doing logistics for a trucking company, bought a house in the suburbs, tried to be normal. But normal didn't quite fit anymore. The routines of civilian life felt hollow after years of high-stakes military operations, and the memories, the firefights, the IEDs, the faces of soldiers who died under his command. Those didn't fade just because he'd changed his address. After retiring, he'd developed a hobby of visiting historical battlefields. There was something about walking the same ground where men had fought and died generations before that gave him perspective on his own experiences. A sense of continuity, of shared burden across time. He'd walked Gettysburg, the Ardennes, Normandy beaches. Each place helped him understand something about what he'd been through, about what soldiers throughout history had been through. His trip to Poland was meant to retrace the opening days of World War II. He'd spent days in museums, walking the reconstructed Old Town, studying the maps and memorials. Now, on his last evening in Warsaw, he wanted to see one of the outlying defensive positions, a wooded area on the city's outskirts where Polish troops had made a stand during the final days of the siege. The location was marked on his military history map, but wasn't set up as an official memorial or tourist site. Just woods now, with a few old concrete remnants if you knew where to look. John rented a car and drove out late in the afternoon, planning to take a short hike before sunset and then head back to his hotel. The woods were peaceful in the fading October light. Oak and birch trees, their leaves turning gold and orange, filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. John could hear traffic from a distant highway, the normal sounds of modern life. It was good walking, the kind of solitary hiking that cleared your head and settled your thoughts. John had his phone playing music through his earbuds, a playlist of classic rock that kept him company without demanding attention. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen leaves that crunched satisfyingly under his boots. A few birds called from the canopy. Peaceful, normal, exactly what he needed. He found the first concrete remnant about 20 minutes into his hike, part of a pillbox or bunker, covered in moss and surrounded by saplings. He ran his hand over the rough concrete, imagining Polish soldiers crouched behind it, rifles trained on the approaches, knowing the Germans were coming but holding position anyway. The concrete was pitted with age and weather, but still solid. Built to withstand artillery, now hosting an ecosystem of moss and small plants, the sun was setting faster than he'd anticipated. The golden light faded to amber, then to deep red. John checked his phone. Still had signal. GPS was working, he was fine, and decided to walk for another 10 minutes before turning back, just a bit further, to see if there were any more remnants of the defensive line. That's when the fog rolled in. It came from nowhere or everywhere at once. One moment the woods were clear, the next they were filling with a thick, gray-white fog that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Not a natural autumn mist. This was dense, opaque, completely unnatural. John's military training kicked in. He stopped walking, assessed the situation. Fog this thick could be dangerous. Easy to lose your bearing, walk in circles. He pulled out his phone to check the GPS, but the screen was glitching, the map refusing to load. Shit, John muttered. He looked around, trying to identify landmarks, but the fog had swallowed everything. The trees were gray shadows in a gray void, and then, distant but clear, he heard artillery fire. Not a recording, not thunder. The distinctive deep crump of heavy guns firing. Multiple guns in a steady rhythm. John's body remembered that sound before his mind fully processed it. His shoulders tensed, his breathing shallowed, his hand instinctively went to his hip where a sidearm would have been if he were still in uniform. But he wasn't in Iraq or Afghanistan. He was in a forest outside Warsaw. There shouldn't be artillery fire. There hadn't been artillery fired here in over 80 years. The sound was getting louder. Not approaching, just becoming more real, more present, as if reality itself was shifting around him. And now John could smell it. Cordite, the sharp, chemical stench of explosives, and underneath it, copper, blood. He started walking, trying to find his way back to where he'd parked, but the fog was disorienting. Every direction looked the same. The artillery fire continued, a steady background thunder, and now there were other sounds. Rifle fire, the chatter of machine guns, men shouting in Polish. John stumbled over something and nearly fell. He looked down and saw it, a trench. Not a natural depression, but a deliberately dug military trench, maybe 4 feet deep, zigzagging through the trees. The earth was fresh, recently excavated. The walls showed shovel marks, but that was impossible. This area had been peaceful for decades. There were no active military exercises here, no reenactments scheduled. The fog seemed to thin slightly, and John saw more trenches extending in both directions. and between them, barely visible in the gray murk, were sandbags, wooden posts driven into the ground, the skeletal framework of a barricade, and soldiers. Polish soldiers in 1939 uniforms. They weren't solid. They had that translucent quality of ghosts or holograms, but they were detailed, specific. John could see the mud on their boots, the sweat-stained caps, the exhaustion in their postures. They manned the trench line in positions John recognized from his own military experience. Overlapping fields of fire, mutual support, a coherent defensive position. They were battered. Bandages showed beneath helmets. Uniforms were torn and blood-stained. Their faces were covered in grime and the gray dust of pulverized concrete. These were men who'd been in combat for days, maybe weeks, men pushed to their absolute limits, but their weapons were still ready. Their eyes still watched the tree line. They were still fighting. John stood frozen, unable to process what he was seeing. His rational mind screamed that this was impossible, a hallucination, maybe carbon monoxide from a hidden source, or a concussion from a fall he didn't remember. But his soldier's instincts recognized what he was looking at. A defensive position, well-constructed, professionally manned, ready for action. The spectral soldiers in the trench weren't standing idle. They were working, checking ammunition, cleaning weapons that had been buried in mud for decades, binding wounds with phantom bandages that would never hold. John watched as a medic bent over a wounded man, trying to stop bleeding from a stomach wound that would have been fatal in any era. The medic's hands moved with practiced efficiency, but John could see the despair in his eyes. There was no morphine left, no real medical supplies, just determination and prayer. John recognized the type. These were the men who didn't quit, who kept fighting past any reasonable point, who held the line because someone had to. He'd served with men like this, had been one of these men, and now he was standing with their ghosts, 85 years after their deaths, still holding a position that had fallen in September 1939. The artillery barrage intensified. The impacts were closer now, shaking the ground beneath John's feet. He could see the flash of explosions through the fog, the brief bloom of orange light, followed by the concussive thud that he felt in his chest. Dirt rained down into the trench. A section of the barricade collapsed, and the Polish soldiers scrambled to shore it up with sandbags, with logs, with their own bodies if necessary. Through the trees, advancing through the fog, came the enemy. German soldiers in their distinctive coal scuttle helmets, moving in tactical formation, rifles at the ready. They looked as spectral as the Polish defenders, translucent and flickering, but no less dangerous for it. The Polish position opened fire. The crack of rifles, the stutter of a machine gun, the sharp commands of a sergeant directing his men's fire. John flinched reflexively at sounds that were too real, too immediate. Spent brass that didn't exist hit the ground around him. The smell of gunpowder was overwhelming. One of the Polish soldiers turned and looked directly at John. An officer, a lieutenant maybe, based on his insignia. The right side of his head was matted with blood, a wound that would have been fatal if he were alive. His eyes, pale blue, sharp, met John's with instant recognition. He saw John, saw him for what he was, a soldier, even if from a different time, a different army. And in that moment of recognition, the lieutenant raised his arm and pointed to a gap in the line. A section of the trench where no defenders stood, where the German advance would break through if it wasn't held. The lieutenant shouted something in Polish. John didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. Get to that position. Hold the line. John felt his body move without conscious decision. Years of training, of responding to orders in combat, overrode his confusion. He ran to the gap in the line, dropped into the trench, felt his hands close around something cold and heavy, a ghostly rifle, as translucent as everything else but solid enough to hold. The German advance hit the line. Spectral soldiers throwing themselves at the barricade, the Polish defenders firing desperately. the noise and chaos of close combat engulfing everything. John found himself working the bolt on the phantom rifle, the muscle memory from his basic training adapting to the unfamiliar mechanism. He sighted on advancing Germans who'd been dead for 85 years and pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked against his shoulder. The sound was deafening. He could smell the powder, feel the heat of the barrel. It was real. All of it was real. Beside him, a young Polish soldier, couldn't have been more than 19, took a round to the chest and slumped into the trench. John caught him, lowered him down, but the kid's eyes were already glassy. Dead, again. Still dying, forever dying, in this moment frozen in time, the battle raged. John lost track of time. It could have been minutes or hours. He fired until the phantom rifle clicked empty, then grabbed for another. The wounded lieutenant was still shouting orders, still directing fire, still trying to hold a position that John's rational mind knew had fallen in September 1939. But in this moment, frozen between times, the battle was very much alive. John could feel the rifle's recoil bruising his shoulder, could taste the metallic bite of fear and adrenaline in his mouth, could hear the wet thud of bullets hitting flesh, the screams of wounded men, the chaos of close-quarters combat where survival is measured in seconds and inches. A German soldier made it to the trench rim, silhouetted against the orange glow of artillery fire. John didn't think. His body acted on 20 years of military training. He brought the rifle up, squeezed the trigger, saw the soldier fall backward. Was he real? Was any of this real? Did it matter? The young Polish soldier who'd died beside him earlier was back now, firing mechanically, dying again and again in an endless loop. John saw him take the same chest wound, saw the same shocked expression, caught him the same way. How many times had this kid died? How many more times would he die before whatever force trapped them here finally released its hold? The German advance pressed closer. The barricade was being overrun. Polish soldiers were falling, one by one, faster than the gaps could be filled. John saw the lieutenant take another hit, this time to the chest, saw him stagger but refuse to go down. The enemy was at the barricade now, hand-to-hand fighting, bayonets and rifle butts, the primal brutality of men killing each other at arm's length. John swung his rifle like a club, felt it connect with something solid, something real, heard the crunch of impact. A German soldier vaulted over the barricade, his face contorted in a mix of fear and determination that John recognized from his own combat experiences. The soldier brought his rifle up, bayonet gleaming, and John blocked it with the stock of his own weapon. They struggled for a moment, locked together, and John could smell the man, sweet and cordite and the copper tang of blood. This wasn't a ghost. This was a man, or the memory of a man. And right now the distinction didn't matter. John twisted, using leverage he'd learned in hand-to-hand combat training 70 years after this battle had been fought, and sent the German stumbling. Another Polish soldier bayoneted the man before he could recover. Blood, phantom blood, but no less visceral, splattered across the trench floor. More Germans poured over the barricade. The Polish line was collapsing. John could see it happening, could see the defensive position being overrun sector by sector. The lieutenant was still standing, still firing his pistol one-handed, his other arm hanging uselessly at his side. Blood, so much blood, covered his uniform, but he refused to fall. "Trzymaj pozycję," the lieutenant shouted. "Hold the position." John didn't understand the Polish, but he understood the tone, understood the desperation. This was the end. They all knew it was the end, but they would make it cost. They would make the Germans pay for every inch, and then, a blinding white flash, not an explosion. Something else. Pure white light that engulfed the entire forest, washed away the trenches and the soldiers and the fog and the sounds of battle. John felt himself falling, or floating, or ceasing to exist. The light was everything. When he opened his eyes, it was morning. John lay on his back in a shallow depression in the forest floor. The sun was streaming through the trees, birds were singing, and somewhere in the distance he could hear traffic. Normal sounds. Modern sounds. He sat up slowly, checking himself for injuries. Nothing. No wounds, no bruises, not even particularly dirty. His clothes were damp from lying on the ground all night, but otherwise he was fine, except for the feeling in his chest, the hollow ache of loss that any soldier recognizes. The feeling you get after combat, after you've stood with other men in desperate circumstances, after you've shared something primal and terrible and bonding. John looked around. He was lying in what was clearly an old trench, the same one he'd seen in the fog, but overgrown now, filled with decades of leaf litter and moss. The trees had grown through where the barricade would have been. Nature had reclaimed everything, but when John looked more carefully at the ground beneath him, brushing away the leaves, he found it. A small piece of corroded metal. He picked it up carefully. It was a button. Military issue with the Polish eagle emblem barely visible under the corrosion. John stood and walked the perimeter of what he now recognized as the defensive position. He found more artifacts, shell casings so rusted they crumbled when he touched them, fragments of rusted barbed wire, a piece of a helmet. He pulled out his phone. It was working fine now, and searched for historical records of this specific location. It took some digging, but he found it. A report from a Polish military historian documenting the final defensive positions around Warsaw. This spot, this exact wooded area, had been held by a platoon of Polish infantry during the last days of the siege. They'd been cut off from communication, surrounded, and had fought until they were overrun on September 27th, the day before the official surrender. The position had been held to the last man. The lieutenant in command, Jerzy Kowalski, had been killed in the final assault, his body found later with 23 bullet wounds, but still gripping his service pistol. 23 wounds. He'd kept fighting long past, when any man should have been able to stand. Kept fighting because that's what you did. You held the line. John pocketed the button carefully. He walked back to his rental car, easily found now in the daylight, and drove back to Warsaw. He spent the rest of the day in his hotel room, not unpacking, not making calls, just sitting and trying to process what had happened. He'd fought in a battle that had ended 85 years ago. He'd stood with men who'd been dead longer than he'd been alive. He'd held a position that had fallen in 1939, and somehow, for a few hours or a few minutes or a few eternities, he'd been part of their final stand. Before leaving Warsaw, John went to the Pulaski Military Cemetery. He found Lieutenant Kowalski's grave, a simple stone marker among thousands. John placed the corroded button on the grave, stood at attention, and rendered a salute. "Mission complete, sir," John said quietly. The line held. But even as he said it, John knew it wasn't true. The line hadn't held. The position had been overrun. The lieutenant and his men had died. Warsaw had fallen, and yet, somewhere in those woods, in the fog between times, the battle was still raging. The lieutenant was still shouting orders. The soldiers were still manning their posts, still fighting, still dying, over and over, locked in the final moments of a battle they couldn't win but refused to lose, because some orders can't be obeyed, some positions can't be abandoned. Some soldiers never learned how to surrender. And in the woods outside Warsaw, on certain foggy nights, the barricade that fell in 1939 is still standing, still defended, still waiting for reinforcements that will never come. The siege of Warsaw ended on September 28, 1939, but in many ways it has never truly ended. The physical city was rebuilt, yes, rebuilt beautifully, painstakingly, stone by stone from old photographs and the memories of survivors. Today's Warsaw is a thriving modern capital, full of life and energy and hope, but beneath the reconstruction, beneath the fresh paint and the restored facades, the old stones remember, the foundations remember, the soil remembers, and according to those who've experienced it, the dead remember too. 40,000 civilian souls lost to the incendiary bombs, the collapsing buildings, the burning streets. Thousands more soldiers who died defending every street, every block, every inch of their city. People who perished from thirst, with a river flowing nearby but no way to reach its water. Men who fought on past the surrender, unaware or unable to accept that the battle was lost. All that death, all that suffering, all that desperate energy. It doesn't just disappear. It soaks into the places where it occurred. It echoes forward through time. It manifests in the basement archives where ashwalkers drift through rooms that were once their crematorium. In the apartments where families still shelter under phantom tables, still dying in slow motion every night at 3 a.m. In the underground pumping stations where the thirst-maddened dead still beg for water. In the forests where ghost soldiers still man their posts, still hold their line, still refuse to surrender. The Siege of Warsaw was one of the opening acts of World War II, but it set a template for the horrors that would follow. The deliberate targeting of civilians, the use of fire as a weapon of terror, the systematic destruction of a city's infrastructure to break its will. Warsaw was a proving ground for the total war that would consume Europe and its scars. Physical and supernatural, run deeper than any reconstruction can erase, the survivors rebuilt. They had to. The alternative was to let the destroyers win, to let Warsaw become nothing but a memory and a mass grave. So they rebuilt, and their children rebuilt, and now their grandchildren and great-grandchildren walk streets that look much like they did before the war. It's an act of defiance, of resilience, of refusing to be erased, and it worked. In a way, Warsaw lives. The cafes are full, the streets are bustling, children play in squares where battles once raged. Life continues, triumphant over those who tried to extinguish it. But victory comes with a cost. The city that rose from the ashes carries those ashes within it, embedded in every stone, every foundation, every reconstructed beam. The architects who rebuilt Warsaw worked from photographs, but they built on foundations that remembered. The masons laid new bricks on old cellars that had served as crematoriums. The plastirers smoothed fresh walls over old ones that had absorbed the screams of the dying. You can paint over trauma, but you can't erase it. You can build over graveyards, but the dead remain. But the past is never truly past. On certain nights when conditions are right, when the fog rolls in, when the temperature drops just so, when someone sensitive to such things is in the wrong place at the wrong time, the barrier between then and now grows thin, and the ghosts of 1939 walk again, trapped in their moment of terror and pain, unable to move forward, unable to escape. They say the city was rebuilt exactly as it was, using old photographs and the memories of survivors. But photographs don't capture screams. Memories fade, become sanitized, lose their sharp edges. What remains in the stones, in the soil, in the electromagnetic echoes that some people can sense? That's the raw, unfiltered horror. That's the truth that doesn't make it into history books or memorial plaques. So here's a question for you. If you ever find yourself walking the beautiful, reconstructed streets of Warsaw's Old Town at night, if you're strolling through Praga after dark, or hiking in the woods on the outskirts, or exploring the underground infrastructure, if you notice the temperature suddenly drop, or smell smoke where there's no fire, or hear voices speaking a language you might not understand, if you see shadows that move with purpose, or feel eyes watching you from empty windows, or sense a presence in places that should be abandoned and forgotten, ask yourself, are you experiencing the present moment, or have you slipped through time into September 1939, into those 28 days when hell came to Warsaw, and 4,000 souls were torn from their bodies in burning, screaming agony? Can you tell the difference between the whistle of the wind through reconstructed archways and the whistle of a bomb falling from the sky? Because in Warsaw, the past and present exist in the same space, separated by the thinnest of veils, and sometimes that veil tears. Sometimes you see through it, and what you see is still burning, still drowning in thirst, still fighting, still dying, still screaming, still waiting for someone to acknowledge that, yes, this happened. Yes, we were here. Yes, we suffered. Yes, we're still suffering. The stones remember, the earth remembers, and the dead, they never forget. If these tales from the ashes of Warsaw sent a chill down your spine, if they made you think twice about the ghosts that haunt our battlefields and our cities, then do me a favor. Hit that like button. Share this video with your fellow history and horror enthusiasts. And subscribe to Ghost Stories of the Battles, because we're just getting started on our journey through the haunted front lines of World War II. Make sure to ring that notification bell so you never miss a dispatch from the other side of history. Next time, we'll be exploring another battlefield where the dead refuse to rest. Another place where the echoes of war still reverberate through time. Until then, keep your eyes on the shadows, watch for the signs, and remember, the past is never truly dead. It's not even past. It's still happening right now, in 1,000 places across this world. Still burning, still fighting, still crying out. All you have to do is listen. This is Ghost Stories of the Battles, signing off. Stay safe out there. And whatever you do, don't ignore the warning signs. Because sometimes the ghosts don't just want to be seen, sometimes they want company.